My boss told me I'd never be anything more than his assistant. 1 year later, I became his boss, and the look on his face when he realized, priceless. I spent 3 years making my boss look good. I scheduled his meetings, I wrote his emails, I covered his mistakes, and I even picked up his dry cleaning when he forgot. I did everything he asked and more. But no matter how hard I worked, he never saw me as anything other than the girl who answered his phone. He had no idea that while I was bringing him coffee every morning, I was planning something that would change both of our lives forever. And when it all came together, he never saw it coming. I started working at Davidson Marketing Solutions when I was 23. It was my first real job out of college, and I was so excited. I had a degree in business, I had big dreams, and I thought this was going to be my stepping stone to something great. The job posting said executive assistant, but they made it sound like there was room to grow. They said they valued ambition. They said hard work got rewarded. That was all a lie. My boss was a guy named Richard Davidson, mid-40s, always wore expensive suits, drove a BMW, and loved reminding everyone that he built the company from the ground up. He had this way of talking to people where he'd act friendly and supportive to your face, but the second you left the room, he'd tear you apart. I learned that pretty quickly. At first, I thought if I just worked hard enough, he'd notice. I came in early. I stayed late. I volunteered for extra projects. I learned every single thing about how the company operated. I knew our clients better than some of our account managers did. I could tell you which campaigns were working and which ones were bleeding money, but Richard didn't care. To him, I was just the person who kept his calendar organized. The wake-up call came when a position opened up. Junior account manager. It was entry level, but it was a real role, a chance to actually work on campaigns instead of just scheduling meetings about campaigns. I applied immediately. I wrote a whole proposal about ideas I had for clients. I was so confident I'd get it. Richard didn't even interview me. He hired some guy named Brett who had half my experience and a degree from a school nobody had heard of. When I asked Richard why I didn't get the job, he looked at me like I'd asked him why the sky was blue. He said I was great at what I did. He said I kept the office running smoothly. He said he needed me right where I was because nobody else could do my job as well as I did. It was a compliment wrapped in an insult. He was basically saying I was too useful as an assistant to promote. I tried to stay positive. I told myself maybe next time. Maybe I just needed to wait a little longer. Maybe I needed to prove myself even more. Then, about 6 months later, another position opened. This time, I didn't even bother applying. I just asked Richard directly if I could be considered. I told him I'd been there for 2 years, I knew the business inside and out, and I was ready for more responsibility. He laughed, not in a mean way, but in that condescending way where someone thinks you're being cute. He said I didn't have the right background. He said the role required strategic thinking and client management skills. He said maybe someday, but I needed to be realistic about my qualifications. I reminded him I had a business degree. I reminded him I'd been managing client communications for 2 years. I reminded him that I'd literally written half the presentations he'd presented to clients. He waved me off. He said writing presentations wasn't the same as leading strategy. He said I was good at executing tasks, but leadership required a different skill set. Then he said something I'll never forget. He said some people are born to lead, and some people are born to support, and there was nothing wrong with being support. The world needed good assistants. I just stared at him. He smiled, patted me on the shoulder, and told me to schedule his 2 o'clock meeting. That's when I realized the truth. It didn't matter how hard I worked. It didn't matter what I knew or what I could do. Richard had already decided who I was, and in his mind, I was never going to be anything more than the person who made his life easier. I went home that night and I cried, not because I was sad, but because I was so angry I didn't know what else to do. I'd wasted 2 years trying to prove myself to someone who was never going to see me as an equal. But then, somewhere between the anger and the tears, I made a decision. If Richard wasn't going to give me a chance, I'd create my own chance. I started researching. I looked into what it actually took to start a marketing company. I read articles. I watched videos. I joined online forums where people talked about building businesses from scratch. And the more I learned, the more I realized it was possible. Hard, but possible. The biggest problem was money. I didn't didn't have savings. I was barely making enough to cover rent and student loans. But I figured if I was smart about it, I could bootstrap something small and grow it over time. So I started working 2 jobs. During the day, I was still Richard's assistant, but at night and on weekends, I started freelancing. I'd reach out to small businesses and offer to run their social media or help with their marketing for cheap. Really cheap. I wasn't trying to make a lot of money yet. I was trying to build a portfolio. It was exhausting. I was sleeping maybe 4 or 5 hours a night. I'd be at the office by 8 in the morning, leave at 6, then work on freelance projects until midnight. My friends stopped inviting me out because they knew I'd say no. My mom kept calling and asking if I was okay because I sounded tired all the time. But I kept going because every client I landed, every project I finished, every good review I got, it proved that I could do this. I wasn't just support, I was capable of leading. I was capable of building something. After about 6 months of freelancing, I had a small roster of clients and a little bit of money saved up. Not a lot, maybe $3,000, but it was enough to make things official. I registered my business. I built a website. I called it Sterling Marketing Co. Sterling was my middle name. I didn't tell anyone at work. I kept showing up every day, doing my job, acting like nothing had changed. But everything had changed, because now I wasn't working for Richard's dream. I was working on mine. My company started small. I was still doing everything myself. I was the account manager, the graphic designer, the copywriter, the bookkeeper, all of it. But I was good at it. My clients were happy. They referred me to other businesses. Within a year, I was making almost as much from my side business as I was making at my day job. That's when I made the scary decision. I quit. I remember the day I walked into Richard's office and handed him my resignation letter. He looked confused. He asked where I was going. I told him I was starting my own thing. He laughed. He actually laughed. He said, "Good luck, but most small businesses fail within the first year." He said I'd probably be back looking for a job in 6 months. I just smiled and said, maybe. I left that day and never looked back. Running my own company was harder than I expected. There were months where I barely broke even. There were times I thought Richard might be right, that I'd made a huge mistake. But I kept pushing. I kept landing clients. I kept delivering good work. And then, about a year after I quit, something crazy happened. One of my clients was a startup in the tech space. I'd been managing their whole marketing strategy, and they were growing fast, like really fast. They ended up getting acquired by a bigger company, and the CEO of that bigger company was impressed with the marketing work. He reached out and asked if I'd be interested in doing a consulting project for them. That project led to another project, and that project led to an introduction to an investor who was looking for marketing companies to add to his portfolio. Long story short, I got an investment, a real one, enough money to hire a team, rent an office, and scale up my operations. Within 2 years of leaving Davidson Marketing Solutions, my company had 15 employees and a client list that included some pretty big names. We were doing the kind of work I used to dream about doing, and I was the CEO. Then, about 3 years after I left, I heard some news through the industry grapevine. Davidson Marketing Solutions was in trouble. They'd lost some major clients. Their revenue had dropped, and Richard was looking for a buyer. I couldn't believe it. The company that told me I'd never be more than an assistant was falling apart. I did some digging. Turns out Richard had made a lot of bad decisions. He'd overspent on office space. He'd hired people who weren't qualified just because they were his buddies, and he'd let client relationships fall apart because he was too arrogant to listen to feedback. The company was bleeding money. My business partner, a woman named Sarah, who I'd brought on as co-o, suggested we look into buying it. She said we could absorb their client contracts, take on their staff, and expand our operations. It made sense financially, but for me, it was more than that. It was a chance to come full circle. We made an offer. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was fair, given the company's situation. Richard's investors pressured him to take it. He didn't have much choice. When we closed the deal, I insisted on being the one to meet with him in person. I wanted to see his face when he realized who was buying his company. We met at a coffee shop. He walked in looking tired, older. He'd clearly been stressed. When he sat down and saw me across the table, he didn't recognize me at first. Then it clicked. His face went pale. He said my name like a question, like he couldn't believe it was actually me. I smiled and said it was nice to see him again. Then I slid the contract across the table. He just stared at it, then at me, then back at the contract. He asked how this was possible. He asked how I'd gone from being his assistant to running a company big enough to buy his. I told him I learned from watching him. I learned what to do and what not to do. I learned that treating people like they're disposable is a good way to lose everything. And I learned that the people you underestimate are often the ones who surprise you most. He didn't say anything. He just signed the papers. After we acquired Davidson Marketing Solutions, I made some changes. I kept most of the staff, but I let go of the people who'd been part of the toxic culture Richard had created. Brett, the guy who got the job I applied for, was actually still there. Turns out he wasn't great at his job, but he was a decent person who'd been stuck working for a bad boss. I kept him on and moved him to a role that fit his skills better. I also brought back some people who'd left the company over the years because of how Richard treated them. I reached out personally and offered them positions, and I made sure everyone was paid fairly. Better than fairly. I doubled the salaries for the assistants and coordinators, the people who kept everything running but never got credit. Richard tried reaching out a few months later. He sent me an email asking if there were any opportunities at my company. He said he had a lot of experience, and he thought he could be an asset. I never responded. I didn't do this for revenge. I didn't buy his company just to prove him wrong. I did it because it was a smart business decision. But yeah, it felt good. It felt really good to know that the man who told me I'd never be more than support had to watch me become the person in charge. People ask me what I learned from all of this, and honestly, the biggest lesson is that you can't wait for permission to be who you want to be. Richard was never going to see me as capable. He was never going to give me a chance. So I had to create my own chance. It wasn't easy. There were so many nights I wanted to quit. So many times I thought I wasn't good enough or smart enough or ready enough. But I kept going, and every small win built into something bigger. Now I run a company with over 30 employees. We do millions of dollars in revenue every year. And I make it a point to treat every single person who works for me with respect. I don't care if they're an assistant or a senior director. Everyone matters. Everyone has something to contribute. And everyone deserves a chance to grow. Because I know what it feels like to be overlooked. I know what it feels like to be told you're not enough. And I never want anyone who works for me to feel that way. Richard was wrong about me. And I'm glad he was. Because if he'd promoted me back then, I might have stayed at his company forever. I might never have taken the risk of starting my own thing. In a weird way, him underestimating me was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to bet on myself. And that bet paid off. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this.